It's the time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Last week, MCC Boston took a second offering in recognition of Fellowship Sunday, a Sunday when all churches within the Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches celebrate the founding of our denomination. The money collected this year will be used to help establish the MCC Disaster Relief Fund, helping MCC churches continue their ministries in the face of disaster. If you weren't able to contribute last week, there's still time. Just add your offering to the basket next to the collection plate this week. Thank you in advance for your participation. This week, MCC Boston is kicking off our 2022-2023 Stewardship Drive. The theme of this year's drive is Stepping Up to Higher Ground. It's a reminder that each and every one of us has a part to play in the ongoing success and forward momentum of our church and its ministries which connect us to our Creator, to one another, and to the community beyond our doors. Coming to worship each Sunday is a holy act, one that through song, prayer, and celebration strengthens our union with God. Through stewardship, we give of ourselves and our resources in response to God's goodness and generosity, taking what we value, our time, our attention, our love, and committing to share these resources with our community of faith. Talk of money during a worship service may be jarring and disquieting. Money is associated with material worlds. Objects, bills, things which bring us back to earth and away from our heart and spiritual longing. But just as we bring our gifts of wine and bread to God's table, we present ourselves as an offering through our financial gifts. Financial offerings are not separate from our spiritual journey. They are a part of that journey. Money is a material symbol, connected not only to our efforts, but also to our talents and abilities, all of which are unique gifts from God. As such, our offering is actually a giving back, an act of worship to God. Our financial gifts enable us to build and maintain ministries, programs, and outreach in support of God's work. The beautiful building in which we sit, our virtual presence, and the support of programs and outreach support a holy mission. Since its founding in 1968, Metropolitan Community Churches have stood at the vanguard of civil and human rights, addressing issues such as racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and other forms of oppression. Wherever there is a need in the world, MCC Global Outreach is there. Through our offerings, we too are there, advancing human rights and social justice around the globe. Each of us is called upon during this year's pledge drive to continue sustaining our church and its ministries. Regular giving helps the board of directors of MCC Boston meet the obligations of this church. Why is it so important for MCC Boston to count on consistent and regular giving? Without it, funding our current ministries and establishing new ministries becomes more challenging. Unpredictable income makes it challenging to meet our obligations, to celebrate our lives, and plan for the future. In our own lives, steady income is indispensable. Receiving a salary, having regular income can make all the difference. A steady income and positive cash flow are very important. Without it, we are left to wonder and worry about how to cover a budget and to cover our expenses. And what is true in our own lives is also true for our church. When we as a community know what we can expect from ourselves, when we pool our collective resources, we essentially provide our church with a salary. We then place our faith community in a position to dream, to contemplate, and to make real the potential we have to affect the community around us in extraordinary ways. Together, we have the ability to raise the consciousness of our community and our world and empower people to reject messages which use misguided biblical interpretation to rationalize intolerance and bigotry, often using words that Jesus never spoke, and all of which Jesus would certainly reject. This year's pledge drive is a reminder that each of us, in stepping up, has a very personal role to play in these ministries, that with the loving participation of you, MCC Boston will step up to higher ground, elevating and strengthening our ministries that will create an enduring message within the broader Christian community, that worship without judgments and free of sexual prejudice and self-righteousness, where the scriptures are used not as a weapon to restrict, but as a bridge to understanding between all peoples, all communities, all believers.
Let's pray. Holy God, we love you, we thank you, and we praise you for giving us life. God, we thank you for this beautiful day, and we thank you for this beautiful worship space in which we have to fellowship together. God, we ask that you look on us and bless these tithes and offerings, these gifts of time and treasure that have been donated. And we ask that you anoint these blessings and bless them so that they may go for the care of this church and doing your work in the world. In all of your many holy names we pray. Amen.
A reading from the book of Genesis. In the course of the night, Jacob arose, took the entire caravan, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. After Jacob had crossed with all his possessions, he returned to the camp, and he was completely alone. And there someone wrestled with Jacob until the first light of dawn. Seeing that Jacob could not be overpowered, the other struck Jacob at the socket of the hip, and the hip was dislocated as they wrestled. Then Jacob's contender said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." Jacob answered, "I will not let you go until you bless me." "What is your name?" the other asked. "Jacob," he answered. The other said, Your name will no longer be called Jacob or heel grabber, but Israel, overcomer of God, because you have wrestled with both God and mortals, and you have prevailed." Jacob said, "Now tell me your name, I beg you." The other said, "Why do you ask me my name?" And he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, face of God, because I have seen God face to face, yet my life was spared. At sunrise, Jacob left Peniel, limping along from his injured hip.
The second reading this evening is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable to show them they should always pray and not lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. There was also a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, 'Give me justice against my adversary.' For a while he refused, but later on he said to himself, 'Though I neither fear God nor have regard for people, yet because this widow keeps on bothering me, I will give her justice. Or in the end, she will wear me out by her unending pleas.' Jesus said, 'Listen to what the unrighteous judge says. Won't God then do justice to the chosen who call out day and night? Will God delay long over them? I tell you, God will give them swift justice. But when the promised one comes, will faith be found anywhere on earth?"
Today we have two different passages about perseverance in the face of struggle. First is the story of Jacob wrestling with the mysterious man in the night, and I'm going to acknowledge here that many of you have probably heard this man referred to as God or an angel, but the text isn't really clear about that. The term used highly suggests that there is something about this man beyond our normal human experience, but no specific name or label is given to the figure. In any case, we see that in continuing his struggle with this mystery man, despite harm to his own body, despite the coming of daybreak, through his refusal to relent, Jacob is given a blessing and a new name. And in Luke, we have the parable of the unjust judge and the widow who would not stop bothering him, to the point that he finally gives in and grants the widow justice, not because he has seen the value in her claim, but just because he would like her to shut up and leave him alone. Both of these stories accentuate the importance of refusing to give up and suggest that those who stubbornly relent from surrender will be rewarded, Taken together, they paint this picture even more starkly, which is not great news for me, because I will be the first person to tell you that this stubborn, relentless struggle to achieve one's goals is not my style at all. On the contrary, I make it a point not to waste too much time pushing on people and institutions that have already refused or ignored me. In these situations, I am very much in favor of giving up and moving on. Or to further draw on the biblical tradition, I'm a firm believer in shaking the dust off my sandals and walking away. When someone has demonstrated to me that they have no interest in hearing my case and considering it fairly, then I cease from making a case, and I leave them to try to figure things out on my own, or to work with someone else who will be more fair with me. And I'd like to tell you that this comes from meekness and humility. I'd like to tell you that I don't wish to overpower others through my determination and bend them to my will. I'd like to tell you that I'm honoring their lack of consent. I'd like to cite the Beatitudes. I'd really like to vindicate my approach here, but I cannot lie to you. It has nothing to do with humility. Ironically, I don't persevere because of my own stubborn pride. Because of my working class insistence on my own dignity. I don't press my luck with those who refuse to listen because I think I'm too good to ask to be listened to. Because I would rather abandon others and cobble together some half-baked solution on my own than lower myself before another by asking them to listen to what I have to say. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who needs to be begged to listen to me doesn't deserve to hear my wisdom, and certainly doesn't deserve to see me falling prostrate before them when they've already refused me. So these stories, as much as there are elements of both that I love, are difficult for me. Take Jacob, for instance. Jacob, who has literally made a name of himself through deceit, considering that his name can also refer to pulling someone's leg, as he did with his brother's heel during their birth. Consider for a second that I am still looking at this as a proudly working class person, and through that lens, Jacob kind of sucks. In this instance with the wrestling, Jacob gained through sheer persistence. But prior to this, Jacob was very much about deception. Jacob tricked Esau into giving away his birthright for a bowl of soup. Jacob tricked his father into giving Jacob the blessing meant for Esau. In these instances, Jacob does not appear before us as the persistent fellow who works until he's reached his goals. Jacob is instead the guy who's willing to cut corners and take from others to get what he wants. Another meaning for the name Jacob is literally supplanter, the one who takes power from the other. Jacob does not learn the meaning of persistence until he finds himself in the position of being tricked. Having worked 7 years to be married to the wrong daughter, and having to toil for another 7 to gain the hand of the woman he actually wanted to marry. And even then, no lesson is learned. Jacob rails against his deceiver, conveniently forgetting that he himself has been the deceiver far more often than the deceived. I'm sorry, but from my perspective, it's hard not to see Jacob as just another person who gamed the system, who took advantage of a loophole in laws and customs and set himself above another, and I do have a hard time honoring that. Especially considering that it is at this very moment, on his way to meet Esau after a long period of estrangement, this is the exact time when Jacob is being presented with the consequences of his own deceit, with the broken relationship of the brother that he has done wrong to. And just when his brother is finally about to catch up with him, Jacob wrestles some supernatural being all night, and voila, no consequences again. And did not Esau persevere? Did Esau not put in the work to build up his own fortune and his own family? Was Esau not quietly persevering in his efforts the entire time that Jacob was scheming? But in the end, Jacob wins out again and ends up with a stolen birthright, one stolen blessing, one coerced blessing, and a new name. Understand, please, that I come from people who believe in putting in the work. People who take pride in the labor of their hands and don't ask to receive anything they haven't earned. People who keep their heads down and their noses to the grindstone in hopes that it will pay off. And so how can I not read this story and feel upset that through a few clever tricks and one wrestling match, Jacob gains the world while his brother gains only toil, sweat, and the fruits thereof? And when I move on and look at the parable in Luke of the widow and the unjust judge, it looks better. We can safely assume that the widow's cause is not deceitful self-promotion, but an actual struggle for justice. Though Jesus never actually explains her struggle, he tells us explicitly that she seeks justice. And I feel comfortable enough taking his word on that, what with him being Jesus and all. And though I may be hesitant to find redemption in Jacob's story, it is easy to identify with one woman struggling against an unjust society. One woman who has lost her husband and gained none of his inheritance, which would have been passed down along the male line of his family. A woman who is all alone with no resources to help sustain herself, and a society that seems firmly set against her. Surely her struggle for justice and her refusal to relent are examples we can believe in and follow. And yet this parable is quite easy to poke holes in. For one thing, we know all too well that the same perseverance that empowered her to stand up and gain success against the injustices of her day, we know already that her experiment would not gain the same results in our world. We have watched this play out. For nearly a year, I worked across the street from the Boston Municipal Court building just down here. And during that time, there was a woman who started standing outside the court with a bullhorn to protest one particular judge, but more generally the injustices of our child welfare system. And I could tell you already that her cause was just because I know the system she was speaking out against. And though she stood outside faithfully every day, unrelenting, and though I can tell you that she certainly bothered everyone around me until they'd be ready to give in to her demands, I can also tell you that her struggle was ultimately not successful, like so many of our struggles against injustice. For example, the vast majority of our nation, something like 70 or 80%, wants sensible gun reform. Many have protested it. The families of the children killed in Uvalde are camping out themselves, waiting for an audience as we speak. Yet the unjust powers in our society have not been moved by our perseverance on that issue. We've also had God knows how many protests against police violence. Droves of people driven to the street to protest the ongoing murders of far too many members of the black community. At the hands of the very police force that claims to protect them. And yet, despite all our work and all our perseverance and all our campaigns to defund the police and allocate that money to someone who could solve the problem peacefully, despite all the perseverance demonstrated by far too many people, police forces have only been granted more funds and more power and more qualified immunity from accountability. For another example, after the recent SCOTUS decision invalidating Roe v. Wade, crowds of people took after the widow's example and protested outside of Justice Brett Kavanaugh's house. Thankfully, our legislative leaders took swift, decisive action to make it illegal to protest outside of the justice's house. This parable sounds really lovely, but it doesn't hold up in a society where the persistent widow can be arrested, tear-gassed, shot at with projectiles, and forcibly removed from the premises. The power of just perseverance cannot stand against the oversized share of power that the unjust judges in our society control. And anyway, this parable ends with the proposition that if the unjust judge will give the widow justice just to be left in peace, then how much more will God listen to and heed our petitions for justice? So why then does it feel like God has not even demonstrated the faithfulness of the unjust judge? Why hasn't she addressed the many petitions for justice that have come across her desk? We are told that God won't delay, but it's hard to feel like that. Did not justice come too late for 13 million people who died stacked atop one another in concentration camps? Did not justice come too late for generations of the black community who were born, lived, and died in cruel bondage? Did not justice come too late for all victims of queerphobia, those murdered, those driven to suicide, those who died in excruciating pain in hospital beds, waiting for others to notice their suffering and do something about it? Did not justice justice come too late for all the indigenous tribes who once graced our land with care and sustainable practice, who have been stripped of their land, beaten down, and killed until only a remnant remains. If God is so much more faithful than the unjust judge, why have so many died waiting for justice? But then again, here's the thing about theodicy is free will always feels like a little bit of a cop-out. Because so many of the problems we pray for deliverance from are patently not of our own doing. Earthquakes, famine, disease, these things are not at all our fault. And yet many have died praying to be saved from them. But I often wonder if we are not the source of most of the problems that plague us. Over the summer, on day 4 or 5 of one of those fun little heat waves we had, I was loading up the van at work when a coworker approached me and said, "Johnny, I have a question about God. Why is it so hot?" And I am thankful that I thought quickly enough on my feet to say, "Hold on there. You can't blame God for this heat. This is climate change. This one is on us, my friend." While there are some sources of misery that cannot be traced back to humanity, there are plenty that can. We cannot blame God for war. We cannot blame God for poverty. We cannot blame God for violence. Once upon a time, we could have blamed God for the weather, but we've somehow managed to also take the reins there and undo ourselves in the process. And even when there are calamities that are not of our own doing, we easily could provide the solution we wanted if we wanted to. But we don't. If humanity all decided to end wars and violence tomorrow, they would cease. If humanity decided to address poverty and famine, they would cease. If humanity decided to reform our healthcare system so that the sick would be given a proper fighting chance, then we could do that tomorrow. We have the technology to end many of the problems that face humanity, but we have not yet managed to convince humanity to save themselves, because to save themselves might involve sacrifices which some of us aren't willing to make. And it is too easy for us to want to blame other humans for those problems, because in a way they are kind of the other person's fault. It's easy for us even to imagine that God, being all-powerful, could solve these problems by softening the hearts of those who stand in the way. But who among us would be the one to accept divine mind control if that's better for humanity? Who would be willing to surrender their autonomy to God in order to benefit our species? Because that's what we're asking for then. For God to deprive the wicked in society of their free will and to direct their actions herself. I am an anarchist. I am not good with authority. I feel like you could all probably guess that by now, given the sheer number of times I have gotten myself into stupid kinds of trouble at work by refusing to submit to the demands of my employer. God is the only one I value obedience to. God is the only one to whom I willingly submit. God is the only force in this world that I am willing to obey. But I can tell you that I'm not willing to give away my own free will either, even to give it to the very being to whom I swear sole allegiance. And if I'm not willing to submit to divine mind control, even though I want nothing more than to be fully obedient to my God, if I'm not willing to submit, I don't think it's fair to ask that anyone else do the same, no matter how awful or evil a person they are. So how are we supposed to take the lesson of this story, then? How can we believe that perseverance will win us the victory against the forces of injustice when our positions never seem to win out, no matter how much perseverance we demonstrate in the fight? An important thing to consider here is that the story of the widow and the unjust judge is not ultimately about the victory won. Neither, for that matter, is the story of Jacob and his wrestling opponent, because none of these parties had any reason to be assured of victory any more than we do. The widow didn't continue to petition the judge because she thought she had a good chance of swaying him. Jacob didn't continue wrestling because he was assured a prize at the end. He wrestled an opponent because they were before him, and he saw that as his only chance in a desperate situation. The widow pestered the judge because it was the only thing left for her to do. She had no other recourse besides him. Even if he had never relented, as our own corrupt leaders never seem to relent from their wickedness, even so, she would have been there shouting at him all the while, because that was what she could do. So maybe the point of this story is not that we must pester God until she gives us what we want. Maybe it's not that we should harangue our judges and politicians until they give in. Maybe the point is the struggle, regardless of the outcome. Because that's what we do in the face of evil. We fight it, even with no assurance of victory or even a decent shot at it. That's what we do as faithful people in a faithless world. Maybe even God's job is not to swoop in and grant us every petition we refuse to surrender on. Maybe God is persevering alongside us, doing everything she can to right our wrongs without forcing us. Surely none among us can claim that God doesn't persevere in the face of societal evil when God went that ultimate step of being made manifest and taking on the flesh of a man who persevered to the extremity, who stood against the evils of his world until those evils killed him, and who even then got back up and went back to working among his followers to prepare them for the same fight. God has been in this fight and has persevered more than any one of us. God continued to guide the children of Israel through centuries of corruption and injustice and invading armies. Jesus stood up to injustice until he was killed for it. The Spirit is with us to this day in our struggles against evil. And maybe through that perseverance in cooperation with God, maybe we will, like Jacob, come to a new understanding. Maybe we will see the way our own actions have caused harm as he did. Maybe we will find that that process turns us into a new and wiser creation, so much so that we too may be called to bear a new name. And maybe all my musings about the futility of justice work are just another example of me giving in too easily, of deciding that I'm too good to struggle for the things I want in life and that I should turn around and walk away when I meet resistance. Maybe even if it comes to nothing, I should still plead my case, still beg, still be willing to surrender my dignity to take up a just cause. Maybe we all should think less about the results and focus more on the fact that there is evil and injustice in the world, and maybe we won't ever be able to change that. But don't we owe it to ourselves to fight until the finish anyway? Thank you.